Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July 2022 Microsoft Patch Tuesday webcast. My name is Rob Brown, and I'm Head of Customer Success and one of the cyber experts here at Syxsense. This month, we actually had a very large release of Microsoft Patch Tuesday. We had 84 patches in total. However, only 4 of those were rated as critical and 80 of those were marked as important. But it is interesting that there were updates for pretty much everything from Microsoft Windows to components, Azure, an awful lot of Azure updates, in fact, Windows Defender, Endpoint Manager, Microsoft Edge, Chromium, BitLocker, Hypervisor, Skype for Business, and in fact, a couple of Microsoft Link updates as well. We also had updates for Print Spooler. So those that have been with us for the last couple of these webinars, we've been focusing on Print Spooler. Well, those vulnerabilities are back with some countermeasures where you can disable the Print Spooler if necessary. Please perform additional testing if you are going to be doing any deployment of the Print Spooler patch, because in the past that's what caused the print nightmare. Adobe also released 27, they fixed 27 vulnerabilities within 4 updates for Acrobat Reader, Photoshop, RoboHelp, and Adobe Character Animator. There are 3 vulnerabilities that were fixed today that can be used as a jump point, and we're going to look at a couple of those today in my top 5 recommendations. A jump point indicates that you are able to move from one technology to another if you are able to successfully exploit it. And obviously this is really dangerous because once you expose an environment through one technology, jumping to another would be incredibly difficult to track. And we also have 33 patches for Azure Site Recovery and Azure Storage. And I don't believe we've ever had so many in a single release. Now we're going to go through all of the vulnerabilities. We're going to go through all of the vulnerabilities in my top 5, but I would like to identify how I'm going to prioritize those top 5, because it's very interesting. We could pick them at random, of course. We could use one particular severity and use that method. We actually at Syxsense use something called a Syx score. We take 6 factors of a vulnerability, and that helps us to prioritize one patch over another. We start off with the vendor severity, which typically starts at critical being the worst, high, medium, low, and NA being the least critical. Then we use the independent CVSS score. And the score actually is from 10 to 0, 10 being the worst and 0 being the least. But if we put the 2 severities together, we kind of do get an additional level of transparency around what the severity should actually be. And that helps when a vendor is sometimes lower or higher than the independent score given by NIST. Next, we look at the state of the vulnerability, and we have 2. First is called weaponized. If a vulnerability is actively being exploited, it means it's being weaponized. Just because a vulnerability is weaponized doesn't mean that it is so easy to weaponize. So you have to look at more data. And we have another state called public aware. Public aware means that the precise method to exploit is available on the internet. A bug bounty program, or maybe the vendor themselves have said, this is the exact condition to exploit the vulnerability. And if you have yes, weaponized, yes, public aware, you kind of have an accelerated risk. Do you want to be the IT manager that didn't prioritize that deployment because the vendor severity was low but the weaponized and public aware was yes. So in that scenario, we add that to the SIG score, and it helps us to have a much better idea about what to prioritize. Now, to balance, we have a countermeasure. We understand, and a lot of our customers understand, that deployment of patches, especially very large ones over very distributed networks all around the world, isn't something that can just be done. Planning is involved, there's downtime, there's time zones. And it's not always possible to do so urgently. So countermeasures help us to balance the risk of rolling out a big patch versus making a change in group policy. Or maybe there's a workaround where you can set a registry key or stop a service. Those countermeasures can be easier to perform very quickly. We do recommend, whenever we highlight countermeasures in our documentation, to review the Microsoft or the third-party vendor stance on the countermeasure. If they recommend to remove the countermeasure when you apply the update, please follow those recommendations. And lastly, we balance all of those with your exposure. So if you have a really bad severity vulnerability that's weaponized and public aware inside your environment, but it's exposed on just 1% of your devices, but you have another vulnerability that maybe isn't so severe, but is weaponized on the majority of your devices, of course, your exposure would help you to prioritize that vulnerability over the previous one. So with that said, let's go take a look at the top 5 that we're going to talk about today. Now, the 5 we're going to pick, there's actually 2 vulnerabilities of the same name with 2 separate CVSS scores. One of them is in fact weaponized. The other one has a scope change, which as we mentioned is the ability to jump from one technology to another. That's number 1 and 3 in this list. We also have Microsoft Graphics component remote code execution vulnerability. We have a very serious remote procedure call runtime remote code execution vulnerability. And finally, we have a Windows common log file system driver elevation of privilege vulnerability to finalize the 5. Now, the first one, we're going to look at CVE 2022-22047. This is the first of 2 vulnerabilities called Windows CSRSS elevation of privilege vulnerability. Now, an attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could gain system privileges. The vulnerability exists due to a boundary error within the Microsoft Windows client server runtime subsystem. That's actually what CSRSS stands for. That local user could run a specially crafted program to execute arbitrary code with those system privileges. And on most systems, system privileges is almost like a local admin. Now, this was identified by the Microsoft Threat Intelligence team, and they've also said that this is being actively exploited in the wild. Now, although it doesn't have the highest CVSS score, it's only 7.8 out of 10, because it is being weaponized, this has actually jumped up to our number 1 priority for the 5. If we take a look at the risk, the risk that it poses, you will need access to a local network, but it does have low attack complexity, no privileges to exploit. It does require the end user to do something. That can be good if your users, in fact, are told that they shouldn't be clicking any emails or they shouldn't go to any websites they're not supposed to, and the scope point on the scope for this one is unchanged. There is no public aware notifications at this point and no countermeasure. So very, very serious. Please prioritize this one as fast as possible. The second one is CVE 2022-30221. This is a graphics component remote code execution vulnerability and has one of the highest CVSS scores of my top 5. Now, an attacker would have to convince a user to connect to a malicious RDP server. Now, this kind of sounds impossible, but it has happened before. And simply running that RDP link could, in fact, connect to that server and therefore deliver that malicious payload to the device. And it will then be able to run under the context of that user. And for that reason, Microsoft has given a severity of critical. The CVSS is 8.8. It's not currently weaponized and it's not public aware with no countermeasures, which isn't the greatest thing. This is actually quite a large update and one that should be prioritized. Third is actually the second of our CSRSS elevation of privilege vulnerabilities. This is typically how sometimes this works, where you get a couple of vulnerabilities that are called the same, but have a different CVE number. And that's because the exploit is different. This one is to do with a locally authenticated attacker could send a specially crafted data packet to the CSRSS service to elevate the privileges from the app container to system. Now, because the app container environment is considered a defensible security boundary, meaning it's supposed to protect those areas, if it is able to bypass it, this is what we call a scope change or a jump point. Now, the attacker could execute the code to access resources at a higher integrity level, that of the app container, and therefore pass out of that container into another technology. Just a hypothetical scenario here is that you could be, within a Windows 10 architecture, and you might be able to jump into a browser technology. That's not this example, but that's just an idea that you're able to jump from one technology to another and move sideways. Microsoft has issued a severity of important, and this has a CVSS, as I mentioned, of 8.8. Now, the risk is attack vector local, so you will need local access to the device, but you do have some bad points where you have low attack complexity, no privileges, no user interaction, but as I mentioned, that scope change, it makes this very, very serious. Our fourth vulnerability is CVE 2022-22038. This is a remote procedure call runtime remote code execution vulnerability. Now, a successful exploitation of this vulnerability requires an attacker to invest time, this is from Microsoft, in a repeated exploitation attempt to the user or to the device, sending data repeatedly to the device to that RPC service. Now, the vendor has issued a critical severity for this one. It has a CVSS of 8.1. And it's quite interesting is that Microsoft and NIST are saying that if the attack complexity wasn't as high, as in it didn't require those multiple attempts of sending data packets to the service, this would actually have a CVSS score of 9.8. But as it stands, its attack complexity is high, which means it's very, very difficult to exploit, but that doesn't mean impossible. There are no privileges required, no user interaction, and it does have a jump point. So should they be able to would they be able to exploit the RPC service, they would be able to jump sideways and therefore go into other technology on the machine. Finally, we're going to look at CVE 2022-30220, and this is a Windows common log file system driver elevation of privilege vulnerability. Now, also This vulnerability, where the attacker successfully exploit this, could gain system privileges. And the note on the vulnerability from Microsoft is that the Microsoft Threat Intelligence team is suggesting that this is more likely to be used in an attack. It is issued a important severity, a CVSS score of 7.8. Luckily, it's not weaponized, it's not public aware. The risk is that the attack vector is local, no attack, low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction, and luckily, finally, of the 5, there is no scope jump point. That concludes my top 5 vulnerabilities. A lot of the vulnerabilities I've mentioned are part of the cumulative update. And in fact, a few of these are available for Windows 7. So if you are still using the ESU extension for Windows 7, which is currently in year 3, you will want to prioritize these updates. Some of these are very, very serious. To reference all of the other vulnerabilities, if you pop along to Syxsense.com, click on the news page, and you'll be able to see a write-up and a description of all of the other CVEs that have been released by Microsoft this month, along with our priority in the order using SixScore. I really hope this has been useful. If you like the new format of this, a short form, please let us know. You can send us an email at info@syxsense.com. If you have any other suggestions or improvements to our webcast, please send those through. We really do enjoy seeing all of the great feedback from all of our listeners. Until next time, I wish you happy patching.